my name's Catherine. I hope you're doing well. Today's video is going to be my November reading wrap up, and I had some ups and downs in November. There were some very high highs but some very low lows at the same time, and a surprising amount of historical fiction, which isn't really my go-to genre. But I read 3 historical fiction books this month with varying levels of enjoyment on my part. So let's get into it. I started off the month with a historical fiction book. I read The Familiars by Stacey. This book is set during the witch trials in England and follows a 17-year-old girl called Fleetwood Shuttleworth, who is under a lot of pressure from her husband to have a child with him. One day while in the woods, she meets the mysterious Alice Gray, who just so happens to be a midwife, and when Fleetwood becomes pregnant, she employs Alice to help her through her pregnancy. However, as their friendship and relationship blossoms, Fleetwood finds herself getting drawn into the witch trials and will stop at nothing to protect Alice from any accusations. This book was on the lower end of historical fiction enjoyment for me. It was okay, but it was definitely not the best book I've ever read or my favourite book. It just wasn't very memorable for me. I've decided for my wrap-ups, actually, I'm gonna have to start writing down what I think of the book directly after I finish it, because I've not been doing that. And yesterday I came to write down all my thoughts on the books I read in November, and I was like, what do I say about The Familiars? Not a lot. The thing I liked about the book was the relationship between Fleetwood and Alice, but there just wasn't enough of it for me. I felt like it didn't go as far as I wanted it to go. And whilst I say the book overall isn't quite memorable for me, there were some tense scenes that have definitely stood out to me and really worked for propelling the story forward. I don't think this is a bad book. I just think it's not to my tastes. I actually took it up to Scotland to lend to my sister because I think she will really enjoy it. Moving swiftly on from a not so great read to an easy 5-star read for me, I read Rouge by Mona Awad and I loved it. Rouge follows a woman named Belle, a dress shop clerk who is obsessed with all things beauty, and she is drawn into a sinister cult following the untimely death of her mother. I actually read Bunny for the first time earlier this year, which is also by Mona Awad, and I did really enjoy it, but Rouge was miles more enjoyable for me. The imagery throughout was stunning. The plot kept me on the edge of my seat throughout. The world Belle finds herself in is so amazingly written that it feels like California is this fantastical, unreal place. Without spoiling anything for you, a pair of red shoes plays a big part in this novel, and obviously red shoes is a really iconic image in cinema set in Hollywood, set in California, from The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz has this gorgeous cinematic moment which is so iconic, where Dorothy finds herself in Oz and the world comes about in absolute colour and wonder. But the red shoes she wears throughout are symbolic of her wanting to get back home so desperately. And I love the use of this imagery in the novel of making California and this cult that Belle finds herself in like this wondrous world that is Oz, but at the end of the day she needs to find her way back home. There are some truly horrific moments in this book, and the sequence of events that occurs towards the end during the climax are incredible, so exciting and shocking and surprising and scary. At the heart of this book, this is a story about the complicated relationship between a mother and a daughter and the unconditional love that binds them even when they're apart, and I think it's really well done and I just really loved it so much. The next book I read was The Unmaking of June Farrow by Adrienne Young. This book follows June Farrow, who is the youngest in a family whose women fall victim to this mysterious curse that had caused her own mother to go mad and disappear, leaving her to be left raised by her grandmother. Following her grandmother's death, June begins to discover a series of cryptic clues that lead her down a road that she could never have imagined for herself, in which she will learn exactly what happened to her mother and force her to make a choice that will change her life completely. I read Spells for Forgetting a couple of months ago and I loved it so much, so I was really excited to read this book. And whilst I did enjoy this book, it wasn't quite as good as Spells for Forgetting for me. I really enjoyed the concept of this book, what the Farrow curse actually entailed. I enjoyed the characters and the overall vibe of this book, but I think the execution fell flat for me at times. What I loved about Spells for Forgetting was that the mystery of the book is revealed to the reader through the use of multiple point of views. We have our two main point of views, but you get snippets, little chapters throughout from other people who live in this remote village. And that kind of teases you as a reader into knowing a bit more than your protagonist, of feeling like you're a little bit ahead of them, and also kind of making you question the validity of your main characters' perspectives. This book was purely from June Farrow's perspective, which meant that as a reader, you only knew as much as June knows throughout the book, which isn't a lot. And for me, that's all well and good, but for me, we weren't given enough reveals at the correct points throughout the book. So it felt a little slower paced. It felt like we weren't getting enough answers to keep me being propelled forward. It was still a page turner, don't get me wrong, but it was more a page turner in like, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, tell me what's going on. And also, the answers that we are given are quite predictable. It feels as though we only know so much as June, but as a reader, you can kind of tell what the answer is going to be. So it makes you a bit frustrated with June, of like, this is so clearly what's happening, catch up. Catch up, girl, please. However, like I said, I really like the overall vibes of this book. Very cozy, and I did have a good time reading it. I really like Adrienne Young's style of writing. I just like fall into the magic of her words and everything. It just wasn't the strongest book plot-wise for me. The next book I read was another historical fiction book, but I loved this historical fiction book. This is The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. This book also revolves around witch trials, but instead of England, it's set in Norway in 1612. The book begins on a remote island during a devastating storm that kills most of the men in the village. Every able-bodied man was out fishing and the boat got destroyed and they were all swept out to sea, leaving the women alone on the island, having to learn how to survive without the men. They end up kind of thriving until tensions arise with the arrival of Absalom Cornet, who is a man who has been sent to kind of govern the island and root out any witchcraft that may be afoot amongst the women. I adored this book so much, and I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. I was expecting to enjoy it, but it has stuck with me so much since reading it. I think about it nearly every day since I finished it, to the point where I think I rated it 4 stars and I might have to bump it up to a 5. Honestly. The book is told from two women's perspective, Maren, who is local to the island, and Ursa, who is Absalom Cornet's wife. At the beginning of the book, we see their lives before they meet each other, and then we watch as their relationship with each other grows and develops, and it is just so beautifully written, and I enjoyed both perspectives pretty much equally. I think maybe I enjoyed Maren's a bit more, but I fell in love with the two characters so much. The book is filled with so many moments that have ingrained themselves on my mind. The moment that hooked me is quite near the beginning, after the men have died and the women decide that they need to learn how to fish for themselves. So they take the boat out for the first time, and this scene drew me in so much. It was like I could literally feel their struggle. I could feel the burn in their muscles, their determination mixed with the feelings of helplessness, and then the ultimate joy and victory and accomplishment they feel with their first catch. It was just exquisite. I think that's my favourite scene in the book. I don't know though, there were so many good moments. On the flip side, there are also scenes towards the end of the book that are so horrific and devastating. I won't spoil them for you because you kind of have to go in not knowing what's going to happen, but the way these scenes are described are so intense and some of the most horrific details I've ever read in my life. I wasn't expecting this book to be as grim as it was. So if you're looking for like an uplifting, empowering read, I will warn you that this is empowering but ultimately quite devastating. So be careful, but I do highly recommend it because it is by far one of the best books I've read this year. And I will say, if you have seen A Portrait of a Lady on Fire and liked that film, I would recommend this book. They're not similar plot wise, but whilst I was reading this book, the relationship between Marion and Ursa just kept like reminding me of the relationship between the two women in A Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Just like how beautiful and tender this love between these two women was. So if you like that film, maybe check this book out. The next book I read was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, another historical fiction. This book follows Agnes, who is the wife of William Shakespeare, and it tells the story of her early relationship with Shakespeare alongside the story of the death of their son and the aftermath of that and the effects that it has on their relationship and their family. In terms of the other two historical fiction books I've read this month, this definitely ranks higher than The Familiars, but lower than the Mercies. What I loved about what I loved about the book was the fact that Shakespeare is never named in the book. He's always referred to in terms such as the husband. And I think that was such an important, poignant writing choice by the author to make sure that the central figure of this novel is Agnes and her family and their life outside of Shakespeare's fame. I say that this isn't a true story. I don't think a lot is known about Agnes. This is fictional. I also enjoyed the writing style of this book, but it was to an extent. This book jumps perspectives a lot, and the author likes to meander through the plot, lingering on seemingly unimportant details before slowly revealing why these details are in fact important to what's going on. And I really enjoyed this style for the first half of the book, but towards the second half it began to get a bit tedious. It also could have been for me that the second half was just a lot more grim, because that's when Hamnet's death happens and we're dealing with the effects of that on the family. But overall it was so well written and I did enjoy some of it. It's just not my favourite. I can totally see why when it came out though it was revered and loved by so many people. My own sister gave it 5 stars, so I think it's definitely just a matter of taste. The next book I read was Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. Icebreaker follows the characters Anastasia and Nate, a figure skater and a ice hockey player who are forced to share an ice rink for practice after a prank goes wrong at their college. This book for me suffered a severe lack of editing. It was so long for no reason. I am not an editor and I'm not going to sit here and claim that I would do a better job at editing this book, especially because this book is very, very successful. But for me, as I was reading it, I could so clearly see where things should have been cut to make this book better paced. Like, there was nothing specifically wrong about the plot for me, but the pacing was so off. The plot beats that happened were coming at all the wrong moments. For example, there's quite a significant thing that happens. Anastasia's figure skating partner is injured. Oh, hello. Anastasia's figure skating partner is injured, so Nate steps in as her figure skating partner to help her practice. There's tension in this because they've already slept together, but they decide because they're a working partnership now, they can't have that sort of relationship while Nate is being her stand-in partner. So for me, with this tension, this could have been the main plot of the book, but instead this happens like, I'm pretty sure it happens like midway through the book, and it could have been made really interesting. Like, the author could have played with this tension. All of the drama throughout the book could have been linked to this plot, but instead we've just got a lot of stuff before this happens and a lot of stuff after this happens. It just seems like multiple plot threads have been woven together instead of picking one and making it really strong. Also, the spice wasn't very memorable for me. The characters weren't very likeable, and it just wasn't a hit, I'm afraid. On the other hand, I did go on to read Wildfire by Hannah Grace straight after, and I am so happy I did because I loved this book so much more than Icebreaker. This is set in the same universe and we have recognisable characters in it. We've already met the main love interest Russ in Icebreaker, but we don't know him that well. So this takes place at a summer camp where Russ and Aurora are working as camp counsellors, but it just so happens that the day they arrive at camp and see each other, it turns out that they had had a one-night stand together the night before. At this camp, there's a no fraternising rule between camp counsellors, so the two of them have to find a way to work together without letting any residual feelings of lust get in the way of their working relationship. I enjoyed this book so much more for a multitude of reasons. I found the characters much more likeable and endearing. The spice was more spicy and fun. The secondary characters were much more entertaining. The plot was so much better paced, even though they have sex right at the beginning of the book. Because of the no fraternising rule that is put in place at the camp, there's still a tension and an obstacle that they have to overcome, which keeps the relationship between them really interesting. This is what I wanted from Icebreaker, so I'm glad that I did get it in Wildfire, and I definitely will be reading the next book that Hannah Grace comes out with because she redeemed herself with Wildfire for me. The next book I read was Anxious People by Fredrik Backman. This book is about a flat viewing turned hostage situation in which a group of people from various backgrounds and walks of life end up bonding together over this stressful situation. This book follows multiple characters, including each of the hostages, the bank robber who is holding them hostage, the father-son police duo who is investigating the case and what actually happened in this flat. And each of these characters are intertwined together and linked together in this one overarching plot that comes together really well. This was a recommendation from a friend for a book club that we've recently started, and so I listened to it as an audiobook on the drive up to Scotland, and I thought the narrator did a really good job. I was in the story from pretty much the first chapter. I really like the writing style and how the story kind of gradually reveals itself to you. Loose ends coming together into really satisfying conclusions and connections to other plot lines throughout the story. I also really loved the message of this book about the importance of human connection and kindness and compassion. And I was actually reading it and it was reminding me of The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which I read a few years ago, but which I think I enjoyed it at the time, but on reflection I find that the message that he was giving in The Midnight Library was kind of forced upon the reader and shoved down the reader's throat a bit. Looking back on it, I don't think there's much nuance to his story, whereas I think Anxious People achieves what Matt Haig wanted to do with Midnight Library and was really successful at letting the reader come to their own conclusions by making the characters simultaneously extremely unlikable but also really endearing and sympathetic. Finally, the last book I read this month was Bookshops and Bonedust by Travis Baldree. This is a prequel to Legends and Lattes, which I read earlier this year and I loved it. This prequel follows Viv, the orc barbarian, when she is younger and forced to part ways from her fellow mercenaries who are on a job in order to recover from an injury. She settles in the seaside town of Merck and ends up befriending the owner of a struggling bookshop and helping them kind of bring the bookshop back to life, whilst also discovering her own love for reading. I was really excited for this book and I was really expecting to love it, but whether it was just that I wasn't in the right mood for this book, I was up in Scotland and quite busy, so I was forever picking this book up and having to put it down. I'm not sure if I would have enjoyed it more if I hadn't been so busy and was able to kind of lose myself in this cozy, slow world for a couple hours at a time, or if it just really wasn't as good as Legends and Lattes. I'm not sure, I just didn't love it. Where I thought Legends and Lattes was kind of the right level of slow, cozy slice of life while still being interesting enough as we watch Viv build this business from the ground up and make friends along the way, this story was just a bit boring. I didn't like the setting or the characters as much as the last book, and the romance that Viv finds herself in just wasn't as interesting to me either. It's so devastating to be saying this because I really loved Legends and Lattes and I had such high hopes for this book, and it's just a bit of a disappointing end to November, but It is the truth. And that's that. Definitely highs and lows this month. Some disappointments, especially Bookshops and Bonedust. I'm so disappointed with that. But I did get a 5-star read and a maybe 5-star read with Rouge and the Mercies. I love them so much and they'll definitely be in my best books of the year. I hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope you have an amazing upcoming week and that I see you in the next one. Bye!